2025, a month that brought 4 more executions across the United States. Each case a story of violence, loss, and a justice system that continues to divide public opinion. In this video, we revisit the men behind the sentences, the final hours before their deaths, and the lingering questions each execution leaves behind. From courtroom battles to the last word spoken, we explore what happens when justice reaches its most irreversible point, and ask whether it truly brings peace or just silence. Stay with us as we look back at every life the state chose to end this month. 1. David Joseph Pittman, Mulberry, Florida. Long before the night of the murders, David Joseph Pittman's life was marked by struggle. He grew up in poverty, often beaten by his mother with a belt from the time he was just 4 years old. He failed repeatedly in school, was teased by classmates, and carried a reputation for being restless and hard to control. Those early scars didn't excuse what he would later do, but they painted the picture of a man who never learned to manage his anger. Years later, Pittman married Bonnie Knowles and became part of her family. But by 1990, the marriage had collapsed into a bitter divorce. The fights were constant, and the anger only deepened when Marie's younger sister, Bonnie, accused him of sexual assault. The charge was dropped, but the damage to Pittman's pride was permanent. He believed Bonnie had humiliated him, and he never forgave her. By then, Pittman's mindset was poisoned by rage and the need for control. Instead of letting go, he came to see the Knowles family not as in-laws, but as enemies standing in his way. And in his twisted logic, the only way forward was to wipe them out completely. In the quiet hours of May 15th, 1990, David Pittman put his anger into action. The bitterness from his failing marriage and the grudge he carried against Bonnie had festered into something deadly. Before he even entered the Knowles home, he made sure to cut the telephone line outside. That one detail showed his state of mind. Cold, calculating, determined to trap the family with no way to call for help. Inside, Pittman went first to Bonnie. She had humiliated him with her accusation the year before, and in his twisted logic, she became the prime target of his rage. When she resisted him and cried out, he stabbed her over and over, finally slashing her throat to silence her completely. Barbara, her mother, was next. She stepped into the hallway, likely trying to protect her daughter, and Pittman turned on her with the same brutal fury. Clarence, the father, tried to reach the phone in the living room, fighting for any chance of survival. Pittman struck him down too. In a matter of minutes, 3 people lay dying, not by chance, but by design. Then came the cover-up. Pittman poured gasoline and set the home ablaze, as if fire could erase what he had done. He fled in Bonnie's brown Toyota, only to abandon it in a ditch a short distance away. Witnesses later saw him return with his homemade tow truck, and soon smoke rose again as he set the car on fire. To him, it was about control, burning away not only lives, but the evidence of his crimes. But the flames betrayed him. Around 3 a.m., a newspaper delivery man spotted the blaze and called authorities. When firefighters extinguished the fire and investigators entered the ruins, they uncovered the truth. The bodies of Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie bore the marks of multiple stab wounds. The autopsy confirmed what the crime itself had already shown. This was not a tragic fire. It was a brutal massacre carried out with rage, vengeance, and cold calculation. The morning after the murders, Pittman already sensed the weight of suspicion closing in. Witnesses had seen him near Bonnie's abandoned car, and word spread quickly. At the urging of his own mother, Pittman turned himself into police. It wasn't an act of remorse. It was fear, and the realization that he could not escape the net tightening around him. When investigators pieced the evidence together, the picture was overwhelming. The cut phone lines, the gasoline, the burned car, all pointed directly to Pittman. Then came the damning testimony of a jailhouse informant who said Pittman openly described how he killed each member of the family. It wasn't just the evidence. It was his own words that sealed his fate. In April 1991, a Polk County jury found him guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with arson and grand theft. During the sentencing phase, his defense tried to present mitigating evidence: his abusive childhood, his poor schooling, his unstable behavior. But the jury was unmoved. They saw a man who planned every step of the killings, a man who chose violence again and again. By a vote of 9-3, they recommended the death penalty. The trial judge agreed. Pittman was sentenced to death on all 3 counts. The judge found 2 powerful aggravating factors: his history of violent crime and the especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel nature of the murders. For the families in that courtroom, justice had been spoken, but the legal battle was far from over. For the next 3 decades, Pittman and his attorneys would file appeal after appeal, clinging to claims of intellectual disability and due process. Time and again, the courts rejected those arguments, ruling them untimely or without merit. Each denial brought him closer to the execution chamber, where the final reckoning still awaited. After 35 years of appeals and delays, the case reached its conclusion. On September 17, 2025, at 6 p.m., David Joseph Pittman was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He became the 12th person put to death in Florida that year, a record pace under Governor Ron DeSantis. That morning, Pittman woke at 5:45 a.m. and ate a heavy final meal of steak, chicken, and biscuits. Hours later, he was led into the execution chamber, where witnesses, including Sheriff Grady Judd and surviving members of the Knowles family, waited in silence. Facing them, Pittman gave his last words: "I know you all came to watch an innocent man be murdered by the state of Florida. I am innocent. I didn't kill anybody. That's it." Moments later, the lethal drugs were administered. Pittman drew several deep breaths before falling still. He was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. Outside the prison, the mood was heavy. Sheriff Judd spoke to the press. His anger focused not only on Pittman's crimes, but also on the decades it had taken to reach this point. Law enforcement officials echoed his frustration, calling it unacceptable that justice had taken 35 years to fulfill. For Sheriff Judd, who had responded to the crime scene in 1990 and never forgotten the brutality of that night, the execution carried a clear message. Holding Pittman's old mug shot beside a family photo of the victims, he told reporters that Pittman had been evil in the flesh, a man who was evil then and never changed. With the chamber silent and the sentence finally carried out, the case that had haunted Polk County for decades came to an end. Justice, long delayed, had at last been delivered. The execution closed the legal chapter of one of Florida's most haunting murder cases. For the community of Mulberry, it was a reminder of lives lost, wounds that never fully healed, and a justice system that, though slow, had finally carried its sentence to the end. The story of David Joseph Pittman was one of anger, violence, and years of legal battles. His actions in 1990 shattered an entire family and scarred a community. For decades, his appeal stretched on, but in the end, the law held firm. Justice in this case had not come quickly, and it had not come without pain. But when it finally did, it carried a message that hatred and violence could not erase responsibility, and that even after 35 years, accountability still mattered. The execution closed the legal chapter, but the emotional cost of his crimes would never be erased. The case of David Joseph Pittman had ended, but the story it left behind remained unforgettable. It was a chilling reminder of how anger and revenge could destroy lives, and how justice, even delayed, was finally delivered. 2. Blaine Milam, Russ County, Texas. Let's start with the case of Blaine Milam, who murdered his 13-month-old daughter, Amora Carson, during a so-called exorcism. On December 2nd, 2008, Blaine Milam, 18 years old at the time, was living with his fiancée, Jessica Carson, in a trailer in Russ County, Texas. Carson's 13-month-old daughter, Amora, became the victim of their shared delusion. Milam and Carson believed the child was possessed by a demon, which led them to perform a brutal exorcism on her. For 30 hours, from the early hours of December 2nd, Milam and Carson subjected Amora to horrific abuse, believing they were ridding her of an evil spirit. Milam struck the child repeatedly, leaving her with broken bones and severe bruising. He also bit her, leaving 24 marks all over her body. Despite the unimaginable pain they were causing, they clung to the belief that their actions were necessary to save her. Carson later revealed that Milam had convinced her that Amora's possession was God's punishment for the child's lies. He claimed that Amora was possessed because God was tired of her lying to Milam. This disturbing belief further distorted their reality and justified their violent actions. Milam's intellectual limitations, his IQ was 68, made him especially vulnerable to Carson's delusion. His inability to critically assess the situation led him to believe the violence was justified, although his defense team later tried to shift the blame to Carson, suggesting she had religious delusions and a visual perception disorder. Milam was still complicit in the brutality. His actions, although influenced by his cognitive limitations, were driven by a deeply misguided belief that he was saving the child. After the abuse, on December 2nd, 2008, Milam and Carson called 911, reporting that they had found Amora dead. The law enforcement quickly arrived at the scene. Initially, they claimed they left her alone in the trailer and returned to find her attacked by an unknown intruder. However, their story changed quickly. They then said Amora had eaten insulation, which supposedly caused her injuries. But as investigators dug deeper, their story quickly unraveled. Milam and Carson eventually admitted to subjecting Amora to hours of brutal torture, believing they were performing an exorcism to rid her of a demon. The couple's twisted story evolved, from a supposed break-in to the child's ingestion of insulation, and finally to the chilling truth: they had been the ones to harm her. In 2010, Milam was convicted of capital murder for his role in Amora's death. The prosecution relied heavily on forensic evidence, including the 24 bite marks found on Amora's body. Despite defense arguments claiming Milam was intellectually disabled, with an IQ of 68, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Milam's lawyers attempted to shift some of the blame to Carson, suggesting that she was the one who had suffered from religious delusions and that her distorted perception led her to harm Amora. However, the court found Milam complicit in the crime, and his intellectual disability argument was not enough to prevent his conviction. His case was further complicated by the discredited bite mark evidence, a key factor in his trial, which would later spark debates about forensic science's role in capital punishment cases. Milam spent years on death row, with multiple appeals seeking to halt his execution. His defense team argued that he should not be executed due to his intellectual disability and the unreliable forensic evidence used in his trial. Yet, the courts rejected these appeals, and Milam's execution proceeded as planned. On May 25, 2025, after years of legal battles and multiple failed appeals, Blaine Milam was executed by lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. He was 35 years old at the time of his death, having spent nearly 15 years on death row. Milam's execution came after multiple attempts by his defense team to delay it. His lawyers argued that he should not be executed due to his intellectual disability and the unreliable bite mark evidence used in his trial. However, the courts rejected these appeals, and Milam's death sentence was carried out. In his final moments, Milam made a statement. He thanked those who had shown him kindness and support during his time on death row, particularly the chaplains who had helped him find religion. His words reflected his religious conversion. If any of you would like to see me again, I implore all of you, no matter who you are, to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and we will meet again. I love you all. Bring me home, Jesus. Milam's last meal consisted of a cheeseburger, oven-fried potatoes, green beans, pinto beans, sliced bread, scrambled eggs, country gravy, a sausage patty, pears, biscuits, tea, and water, an assortment that reflected his last request for comfort before his execution. Blaine Milam's execution highlights the complexities of justice. While it may bring a sense of closure, it also raises difficult questions about fairness, especially considering Milam's intellectual disability. Was it just to execute him, or did the system fail to address his mental limitations? 3. Geoffrey Todd West, Alabama. The case of the next death row inmate in today's video, Geoffrey Todd West, was executed quickly, and West was not given the opportunity to appeal his sentence when he expressed remorse too late. In March 1997, Geoffrey Todd West, just 21 years old, had once worked at Harold Chevron, the very place he would return to on March 28, 1997, with his girlfriend to commit a robbery. Margaret Parrish Berry, 33, was the store clerk on that fateful night, simply doing her job. Their paths had crossed only in passing, but for West, desperation had reached a breaking point. Faced with financial struggles, he decided to rob the store. But when Berry became a witness, West made the brutal decision to kill her. On the night of March 28, 1997, Geoffrey Todd West walked into Harold Chevron with one thing on his mind: to rob the store. Armed with a .45 caliber handgun, he made his way behind the counter, where Margaret Parrish Berry, the 33-year-old store clerk, was lying on the floor. What started as a robbery quickly turned into something far darker. West took $250 from the store's money jar, but when Berry glanced up, her eyes met his. In that instant, West made a decision that would forever alter the course of his life, and hers. He shot her execution style in the back of the head, ensuring she couldn't identify him. The shot was swift, final. Berry, a mother of two, had no chance. In that moment, West didn't just steal money. He took a life, silenced a witness, and sealed his fate. West and his girlfriend didn't get away for long. Within days, they were arrested, and the details of the crime became clearer. West's girlfriend, in exchange for a lesser sentence, testified against him, revealing how desperate they were for money. But the truth about West's actions was much more chilling. It wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. West's decision to kill Margaret Berry wasn't born out of panic. It was cold, calculated, and deliberate. In the weeks after the crime, West would reflect on that fateful night, torn between his youthful desperation and the horror of what he had done. Even now, as a grown man, West struggles to reconcile the person he was with the man he became after the murder. During his trial, West faced the consequences of his actions. The jury found him guilty of capital murder, and the sentence was clear death. The brutality of the crime left no room for doubt. But what's even more unsettling is that the coldness of West's decision to kill, to eliminate a witness, to take a life for a mere $250, was met with his own regret in later years. But remorse, though powerful, doesn't undo the destruction caused. The court's decision to convict him was not just a matter of justice for Margaret Berry. It was the stark reminder that sometimes the things we do in a moment of desperation haunt us forever. West's remorse may have come too late to save anyone, but it was real, and it was tormenting him. Prior to his execution, West received 8 visitors and 2 phone calls. Other than his final meal of chicken quesadillas and snacks throughout the day, he refused all other food. When the time had come, West was strapped to the gurney with a blue-rimmed gas mask covering his face. The warden asked if he had final words. He replied, "No, sir." Then he gave a thumbs up in the direction of his attorney as the execution began at about 5:56 p.m. West's eyes were open as he appeared to gulp and struggle for breath during the first 2 minutes. At about 6:01, he began to take a long series of breaths with long pauses in between before becoming still at about 6:07. He was pronounced dead at 6:22. In a final statement provided by his attorney, West said, I have apologized privately to the family of Margaret Parrish Berry, and am humbled by the forgiveness her son, Will, has extended. West's execution will mark a grim milestone in Alabama's use of nitrogen gas as a method of carrying out capital punishment, and the reactions from both supporters and opponents of the death penalty are bound to echo in the following days. Will Berry, the son of Margaret Parrish Berry, has expressed his forgiveness toward Geoffrey Todd West, despite the horrific crime that changed his life forever. In interviews and letters, Berry has made it clear that he does not want to see West die. He believes that vengeance is not for the state to decide, but for higher power. I don't want this man to die. It won't bring my mother back. I just want peace and healing. His request to meet with West before the execution was denied by prison officials, citing security concerns. Though West's execution has been carried out, the reflection on justice and punishment remains a complex question for the victim's family. For Will Berry and his loved ones, the question still lingers. Does justice truly mean ending a life, or is there a greater power in forgiveness? As we reflect on the executions of Blaine Milam and Geoffrey Todd West, we are reminded of the complexities of justice and the lasting impact of their actions. Milam's case, complicated by his intellectual limitations, and West's cold-blooded decision to kill for a mere $250, both raised difficult questions about punishment, remorse, and forgiveness. For some, justice may have been served, but for others, the pain and the questions will linger forever. 4. Victor Tony Jones, Florida. He was shot in the forehead, but still alive. Bleeding and dazed, Victor Tony Jones sat on a couch surrounded by blood, holding the belongings of the two people he had just killed. Just moments earlier, Jack and Dolly Nestor, a kind elderly couple who had given him a job only 2 days before, were stabbed to death inside their small Miami workshop. Jack, fatally wounded, fought back with a pistol, one final act of courage before he fell beside his wife. A simple act of kindness had turned into a scene of horror, driven by a mind twisted by years of pain and anger. Victor Tony Jones was born in 1961 in Florida. From a young age, his life was marked by neglect and violence. As a teenager, he was sent to the Okeechobee School for Boys, a reform school later exposed for brutal beatings, isolation, and abuse. There, boys were whipped, humiliated, and left in solitary confinement for days. Jones was one of them, a child punished instead of protected. Years later, he carried those wounds into adulthood. He drifted between prison sentences and short jobs, never finding stability or trust. By December 1990, he had just been released from prison and was desperate to start over. That's when he met Jack and Dolly Nestor, an elderly couple who owned a small engineering business in Miami. Jack was an inventor, kind, patient, known for giving work to people who needed a second chance. When Jones came looking for a job, Jack said yes. For a brief moment, it seemed like life was finally offering him a way out. But kindness can sometimes awaken the deepest fears. 2 days later, when Dolly refused to pay him for unfinished work, Jones felt something old and familiar: rejection. In his mind, it wasn't just about money. It was about being dismissed, humiliated, and powerless again. That moment of wounded pride, mixed with years of buried anger, became the spark that set off everything that followed. It was the afternoon of December 19th, 1990, just days before Christmas. Inside the small workshop in Miami, Jack and Dolly Nestor were finishing their day's work. Victor Tony Jones, their new employee, had been quiet that morning, keeping to himself, his expression unreadable. At some point, a disagreement began. Dolly refused to pay him for a task she said wasn't finished. To her, it was a simple work issue. But to Jones, it felt like a personal rejection, another reminder of a life filled with disrespect and pain. In a sudden burst of rage, Jones grabbed a knife. He followed Dolly into the bathroom and stabbed her once in the neck. She collapsed instantly. Hearing her scream, Jack rushed in from his office. A violent struggle followed, desks overturned, tools scattered, blood spattered across the floor. Jack was a strong man in his 60s, fighting for his life and for his wife. Jones stabbed him in the chest, piercing his heart. But even as he was dying, Jack reached for his small pistol and fired 5 shots. One bullet struck Jones in the forehead. Minutes later, the shop fell silent. Jack and Dolly lay dead, side by side. Jones, bleeding but conscious, sat down on a couch. When police arrived, they found him surrounded by the couple's wallets, keys, and Dolly's purse, his pockets stuffed with their belongings. At the hospital, still wounded, Jones told the nurse, "They owed me money. I had to kill them." It was a cold, detached confession, the voice of a man long disconnected from empathy. In that moment, his past and present had collided, the abused child and the angry adult becoming one. Investigators quickly pieced together what had happened. Jones was arrested that same day and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and armed robbery. In 1993, the case went to trial. Prosecutors called it a cold-blooded act driven by greed. The defense argued Jones was deeply damaged from years of abuse at the Okeechobee School for Boys. But the evidence was overwhelming: the murder weapon, the confession, the stolen items. The jury convicted him on all counts. They voted 10-2 for the death penalty in Dolly's case, and 12-0 in Jack's. The judge agreed. Jones was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Over the next 30 years, he filed numerous appeals. His lawyers pointed to his low IQ and childhood trauma as reasons to reconsider the sentence. But courts repeatedly ruled that the evidence came too late, and that the original verdict would stand. In the end, the system made its decision clear. The man who took 2 innocent lives would face the ultimate punishment, no matter how troubled his past had been. On September 30th, 2025, after more than 3 decades on death row, Victor Tony Jones was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He was 64 years old. Before the execution, Jones was served his final meal: fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet tea. A simple, Southern meal, calm before the end. At 6 p.m., the curtain opened. The warden asked if he had any last words. Jones looked straight ahead and said quietly, "No, sir." As the drugs began to flow, his chest moved once, then slowed. At 6:13 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Witnesses described the process as silent, almost mechanical. There were no complications, no struggle, only stillness. Outside the prison, protesters gathered with signs and candles. Some prayed for the victims. Others questioned the system that had taken yet another life. Inside, justice had been carried out. The 13th execution in Florida that year, a modern record for the state. But for those who watched, it was hard to call it closure. It felt more like the final chapter in a story of violence that began long before the murders ever happened. Among the witnesses that evening was Irene Fisher, the only daughter of Jack and Dolly Nestor. For 35 years, she had lived with the memory of losing both her parents in one brutal day. When the curtain closed, Irene spoke softly to reporters outside the prison. "After seeing what I saw tonight," she said, "I wish my parents had that opportunity, to die so gracefully. Just close your eyes and go." Her words carried both relief and sorrow. For her, justice had finally arrived, but it did not erase the loss. A life had been taken, but nothing could bring her parents back. In later interviews, Irene revealed something even more powerful. "I do forgive him," she said, "because forgiveness sets me free. But I'll never forget." Her voice trembled, not with anger, but with understanding, a reminder that even in the shadow of justice, grief does not disappear. It only learns to live quietly beside forgiveness. The execution of Victor Tony Jones closed a case that began 35 years earlier. For the state, justice was done. For the Nestor family, peace finally felt possible, if only in part. But the story of Victor Jones is more than a crime and a punishment. It's the story of how violence can shape a person, and how it can echo through generations. He was once a child beaten and broken by the very system that later took his life. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it forces us to ask, how many lives are lost long before the crime is ever committed? In the end, no court ruling, no execution, can truly undo what happened. It only reminds us that every act of violence, on any side, leaves behind another scar that time alone cannot heal. Justice was served, but peace is never simple. 2 innocent lives were lost. Another ended on a gurney. For executions. For final moments. And still, the same question remains. Does justice end with a death, or does it begin there? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories that uncover the human cost behind every verdict.